Hi, and welcome back to a very sweaty episode of The Next Shift. It's currently a heat wave here in the UK, and I want us to focus on something slightly different to what we usually do here. And I want us to focus on a term stroke ideology that you may have never heard of called presumption. Specifically, I want us to focus in on the structural shift in the labour market that doesn't necessarily show up particularly clearly when it comes to employment or economic statistics and data, but has everyday extraordinarily significant implications once you start to understand how it's changed all of our lives. And for the large part, for the worse. Presumption is the idea that some forms of work out there haven't been automated as such, nor have they disappeared altogether, but actually been redistributed often away from firms back into consumers' time. It's created a marketplace for your time, and businesses are becoming increasingly creative on how they spend it. Presumption isn't a new thing. It's actually been around for half a century or so now. It's actually popularized in 1980 by a chap called Alvin Toffler. But the underlying idea is actually much, much older than that. And if you go back far enough, most economic activity actually looked like presumption. Households produced a significant proportion of what they consumed, whether that be food, clothing, or general services, without a clear distinction between what is the worker and who is the customer. But when industrial capitalism came into place over the 18th and 19th centuries, we actually began to separate these roles. Production obviously moved to factories, consumption moved into the markets, and wage labour sat in between. What Toffler was trying to point out is that the separation between both consumer and the working market might not actually be permanent. He argued that advanced economies would begin to move back towards a system where production and consumption were reintegrated with one another, not in the same form as they were before, but through technology. And as we know, this prediction turned out to be broadly accurate, but we're seeing it supercharged in the last decade as we move towards a subscription-based, rental-dominated economy. From around the early noughties or the early 2000s onwards, and with the rise of the internet and what's often called Web 2.0, presumption became a much more visible and much more central part of our economic activity. As to not lose you and just showcase a generic example of this, or potentially the best example of this, you're probably watching this on either YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and I think user-generated content is the best example of modern-day presumption. Platforms like social media, forums, and marketplaces rely almost entirely on its users to generate its content, its moderation signals, and data that then creates value. As one line of research would put it, the user has effectively become the main contributor of all value in these sorts of digital environments. However, at the same time, firms began systematically redesigning their services so that consumers like you and I would take on tasks that were previously performed by its employees, not just in media, but in retail and in banking and in travel and in customer service in general. This was then very cleverly marketed and consigned to the ideology that you were becoming the empowered part of the process, that the consumer was the empowered part of the supply chain, and that you could cut out all of the faff that stood between you getting a job done personally and having to use these laborious in-person services. However, this obviously then pushed all accountability on how those products and services worked right on top of your shoulders. What you might then notice in marketing literature and commercials is that this is often referred to or directly described as co-creation or user participation. The framing is that consumers are actively involved in creating the value, and that this benefits both the firms and its users. There is, however, a far more critical interpretation of this within sociology. George Ritzer and others describe this as a shift towards a prosumer economy, where labour is effectively transferred away from paid workers to unpaid consumers. And in that framing, presumption is not just participation, it is a restructuring of where labour sits in the economy, and with a clear trend towards unpaid rather than paid work. Other thinkers will go a step further than that and argue that this represents a continuation of traditional capitalist dynamics in a very different form, where firms don't just extract absolute value from its workers, but from consumers' time, their behaviour, their data. So what does this look like in practice? Well, if you were to map it onto everyday economic activity, the pattern is relatively straightforward. In retail, self-checkout systems shift the entire transaction away from a paid worker to an unpaid consumer. In banking, mobile apps replace a large proportion of branch-based interactions. In travel, check-in, boarding passes, and customer support are increasingly handled by users themselves. And individually, this is all framed as a convenience, and a lot actually is, but for both parties, and that's critical to understand, because when you use a trained cashier, for example, they can scan and bag your items on average 30% faster than you can. The average transaction time is around 30 seconds faster than using a self-checkout machine. But again, the convenience of not having to line up for too long and to bag your items just as you would like to do it without the stress of somebody looming over you is often framed as a convenience. But for a store that sees, say, 3,000 customers a day, like a Sainsbury's local in the UK, and if 2/3 of those customers start using those machines instead of a cashier, then you've saved them around 16 hours, 40 minutes from those extra 30 seconds that add up over time. At an hourly wage of £13.23 that Sainsbury's pay, for example, they've recouped around £215 of customers' time each day. The counter-argument here is that I'm not playing very fair and that it's not always a substitution of one machine per one worker, but what tends to change is the overall labour model. There'll be fewer front-facing roles, more capital investment, and a redistribution of smaller tasks across a much larger user base. And when I said at the start of this video that it's very difficult to track economic data based on this, from an employment perspective, it will show us far less outright job losses and much more recomposition. And obviously some roles then decline, particularly those which are routine and transactional. Others change and they become more supervisory, maybe more technical. And some work doesn't disappear at all. It just becomes invisible to you and I because it's no longer classified as employment. Again, what I said at the start of the video, it's not automated, it doesn't disappear, it's just redistributed. However, there genuinely is a large body of evidence that these systems can be explicitly designed to reduce overall labour costs. Self-service technologies, for example, are often publicly justified on the basis of efficiency and cost reduction and, like I said, convenience, particularly in sectors with large numbers of low-wage roles. But there's a backdrop to all this. At the same time, the broader labour market has seen growth in freelance work, in platform-mediated labour and self-employment, which suggests that labour is not vanishing, but becoming more fragmented and less institutionally anchored. And so one of the more revealing ways to understand presumption is through generational attitudes towards something as mundane as furniture assembly. And yes, I will be picking on IKEA and flat pack furniture. For older cohorts, furniture was typically delivered as a full finished product. You went to a shop, you chose a table or wardrobe, and it arrived assembled, or it was assembled there for you. The labour component was embedded within the price, and the expectation was that you were paying for a completed good, not participating in its production. Younger consumers, by contrast, have grown up with flat pack furniture as the default. The idea that a product arrives in pieces, requires tools, instructions, and a degree of trial and error to complete is not seen as unusual to us. It is simply part of the purchasing process. In that sense, the assembly work, which would have been previously performed by a paid worker, has been normalised back into a task that should be carried out by the consumer. And the difference in expectation here is not trivial because it represents something far broader within the labour market and how it's perceived. For one generation, assembly is an additional burden and one which even creates a point of friction. For another, it is built onto the definition of the product itself. And that matters because it shapes how easily this model really scales. When a cohort or a generation enters adulthood already accustomed to completing part of the production process themselves, then the transfer of labour from the firm to the consumer becomes less visible and significantly less likely to be challenged. More research suggests that the process is no longer just limited to specific transactions, but is extending into broader areas of our lives. So if you'll indulge me for a moment to get a little bit philosophical, the idea of the presumed self, for example, showcases how activities like self-tracking, content creation, digital interactions all generate value continuously, often without being recognized as true labor. In that framework, it is not just specific tasks that are being externalized, but entire behaviors and lifestyles. And this is where presumption starts to overlap with discussions regarding privacy, data, surveillance, platform economics, because the value being generated is no longer just functional, it is informational. So this is an employment channel, so why does this all matter? Well, the reason that this matters for employment, particularly for young workers, is that entry-level roles tend to sit closest to the types of tasks which are the easiest to externalize. Historically, many of these roles were transactional and often process-driven, which is exactly the kind of work that can be shifted onto users or onto embedded digital systems. And there are two parts to this which are happening at the same time that I find equally concerning. Because most of these roles, they were providing a function outside of their immediate economic value. The first function is a better quality of service, better quality of product, better quality of aftercare. You're definitely noticing that on all your products and services right now, that things are just more broken more often and we're more accepting of it. The second piece is more to do with employment, because these roles were acting as entry points into the labour market, providing basic experience, exposure, and pathways into more stable recruitment or more stable employment. If those roles continue to shrink or change in structure, the transition into work becomes less direct and less structured, which has knock-on effects that aren't just immediate, but they can be really visible in later careers. And this connects quite closely to the idea of labour market scarring, which is a video that I've already created. It was a short as part of a longer video, but I think I will be doing a separate video as to the definition behind labour market scarring and some of the statistics behind it. If individuals struggle to access stable, structured work early on, then it tends to persist in the form of lower wages, slower progression, and weaker attachment to the labour market. If presumption contributes even partially to reducing the availability of those entry points, then its effects are not just immediate, they are cumulative. So the point here is that work isn't disappearing in the traditional sense, but the boundaries to what we classify as work are definitely moving. Yes, some labour is absolutely being automated. Some labour is moving towards flexible or contingent forms of employment, but some of it is being absorbed by consumers themselves, often in small increments, often framed as a convenience, and often without being recognised as labour at all. So coming out of this video, I want you to do one thing, and that's track your movements next time you make a purchase online for a piece of furniture or an appliance. There's a couple of examples I want to raise here. Were there any insignificant elements that you had to weirdly put together? Think about, when you get two bolts and such like that, which realistically should have come in the same pack, or they should have been pre-built for you. Something really, really insignificant. That's somebody probably being cut out of the supply chain or a piece of machinery that they're no longer choosing to maintain. Were there any pieces of waste that seemed a bit obtuse for the amount of product that you're receiving? Think about it when you order a barbecue, for example, and there might be 30 bolts in there, but you only need to use 10 of them. Well, that waste is something which is put onto you, not onto them to have to get rid of. Were there any significant changes to your algorithm after you purchased it? You are providing user research, maybe user participation, engagement on shaping your algorithm in the future that's then being used by ad companies, which might be directly playing with who you purchased from. And then you can be really annoying at dinner parties and tell everyone that process in itself was called presumption. This has been The Next Shift, and I'll see you on the next one.